Are you all having a good time? Well, it doesn't sound too enthusiastic. I'll ask again after I've given my presentation. I hope it's a bit louder. This is a difficult presentation to give because I played a fairly minor role in the production of this research. The real credit belongs to Professor Jenny Williams at Melbourne University. So I'll do my best to carry her work forward. It's doubly difficult because I'm following an A, and you know, she's a hard act to follow, I can tell you that. So all I have to do now is work out how this works. Is somebody going to change that, or do I do something to make it change? Oh, no one's going to tell me. The green button, you know I'm red-green colourblind. Does that work? No, not that one. The larger one. Ah, it works. Okay, so the background of this, of course, is just as in France, Australia has had a big problem with the growing prison population. We love our law and order crises, and so you can see that the imprisonment rate in Australia has doubled since 1988. Australia is no exception to that. New South Wales is no exception to that. We've seen a growth by about a third in the number of prisoners since 2013. And this has excited interest, as it always does, in finding alternatives to custody before the next law and order crisis when we build up the numbers again. So electronic monitoring, as Anne so eloquently pointed out, looks like a promising alternative. As she mentioned herself, Ditella and Shagrodsky, got that, examined Argentina's pre-trial use of electronic monitoring, which interestingly enough is available for all crimes. We always have a panic attack about putting any kind of violent offender on electronic monitoring. And they found a reduction in recidivism amongst those who got electronic monitoring of between 11 and 23 percentage points relative to prison. An A, as you heard this morning, I don't need to tell you, found a substantial reduction for France, using it as an alternative to custody, and found a reduction of around 6 to 7 percentage points, which is very encouraging. And Marie, as she said herself, in fact, maybe I'll just pass this over to you and you can finish. You've done it all. So it does look promising for electronic monitoring, and we've just heard from South Australia further evidence that it looks like a promising alternative. So a bit about electronic monitoring in New South Wales. As you can see, it's linked to home detention. It's been available as the same length of time, it appears, from France. In 1997 it was established. It had a strong rehabilitation focus until 2007, when we had one of our customary panic attacks about prisoners being treated too softly. And so what they did then was to establish what's called a Community Compliance Monitoring Group, which was a sort of a hit squad that ran around turning up unannounced at prisoners' homes and testing them to see whether or not they were taking drugs. So it shifted from a kind of rehabilitation focus to a deterrence focus, and not surprisingly, when that happened, the likelihood of a positive recommendation for electronic monitoring fell, and judges became less likely to recommend electronic monitoring. So that's the pattern. You can see on the left-hand side, you've got the number of people who got electronic monitoring from 1996 onwards, and on the right-hand scale, you see the percentage of all dispositions. So the first thing to see is that as a raw number and as a percentage, it shot up, and then when the CCMG started, it started falling down. So this just shows you, by the way, how it's possible to completely eliminate a sanction without actually changing the law. All you need to do is create a community compliance monitoring group, and they'll do all the work for you. The other thing to notice, though, is that electronic monitoring never became a substantial alternative to custody. Never really got to 1% of all sanctions. So even at its peak, it was not a popular alternative. So it was disbanded in 2013, and of course the immediate media reaction was a free pass to paroled crooks. I know you love this kind of stuff, so I thought I'd just tell you what the media reaction was. New South Wales criminals on parole will be given newfound freedom, like in addition to all the freedom they're currently enjoying, after the state government dumped its specialist monitoring group. Right, so current policy, the world having changed substantially, is to actually expand the use of electronic monitoring in New South Wales and they've introduced new electronic monitoring equipment. Now apparently it's going to become possible to, perhaps it is now, to identify hotspots, places where offenders frequently go, as well as actually tracking them continuously to check their movements. It's now going to be applied to high-risk domestic violence offenders, or is being applied to them. It's also going to be applied to offenders serving intensive correction orders. For those of you who don't know, an intensive correction order is one that combines intensive supervision with intense rehabilitation. So they're going to be playing it for that. Eligibility for electronic monitoring in New South Wales, and I'm talking now about the time where the study was conducted. I don't think the basic procedure has changed, but I'll just go through it for you. As in France, you have to first decide that prison is appropriate, and if so, select a sentence length. If the sentence is less than or equal to 18 months, offences aren't violent or threatening, and past offences aren't violent or threatening, then the offender can be referred for electronic monitoring assessment. I thought it was really interesting when Ane was pointing out that the next judge, a separate judge, makes the decision about whether you're going to get it. That would be a very interesting way to go about testing it. So suitability is assessed by the New South Wales Community Corrections Service, and if they determine that the offender poses no substantial threat to the family or community and can be managed successfully on home detention, they have a home for a start, and crucially, if the family and co-residents consent to home detention, then what can happen is the Probation and Parole Service can recommend home detention electronic monitoring to the court. But of course, the final decision is up to the court. So in practice, what does it look like? Well, you can't leave home without approval. On the other hand, you can get approval for work and medical commitments and interventions. So what happens is that they develop a schedule. The corrections officials and the offender develop an agreed schedule. And so the staff doing the electronic monitoring actually have this schedule sitting in front of them. So each hour of the day, they know where the offender is supposed to be, and they can check to see that the offender is where he or she is meant to be. So a breach of a schedule, mostly as I understand it, not always, but a breach of a schedule without adequate explanation results in an arrest warrant, and the person comes straight back to prison. Participation in rehab programs during the period of our study was mandatory, so it wasn't just surveillance, it was also rehabilitation. So needless to say, all we wanted to know is whether electronic monitoring reduces reoffending more effectively than prison. So you're probably all tired of hearing about two-stage least squares, but if you'd love to see more of it, I'll take you slowly through the process. If you don't, just turn on your phone and look at the news or something like that. So we're basically going to try and estimate an equation that links reoffending to that EMI, which is a dummy variable, 1 if the person gets electronic monitoring, 0 otherwise, and that beta coefficient is what we really care about. We really want to know whether that coefficient is significant and how strong it is. The B prime xi just covers factors that might also be related to the likelihood of getting electronic monitoring or the likelihood of reoffending and so on. But of course, the problem, as everybody's been telling you, is that we've got potential problems of selection bias. So what are we going to do about that? I'm skipping all this because I know you hate equations. Look at that. So there's a diagram, and this depicts our problem. We've got unmeasured factors, things like remorse, family ties, employment, etc., that influence both recidivism and the penalty. And we can't get measures of all these things and whack them in the equation. We have to find some other strategy for dealing with that. Otherwise, our estimate, that beta coefficient I told you about, is going to end up being biased and inconsistent. Mercifully, we have a solution in the form of two-stage least squares, which, as half a dozen people have already told you, requires a variable that influences the penalty you get, but has no effect on recidivism except through the penalty. And I can hear you all asking, what might such a factor be? Well, here's the answer. I used to curse the fact that Australia had such disparate patterns in sentencing and judges couldn't agree with one another. Now I think it's fantastic because it gives us this wonderful variable, judicial disparity in sentencing, which acts as the perfect instrument for finding out the causal effect of interventions. So that's the start of the law term there. I don't know any of those judges, and I hope if anyone's here, I haven't offended anybody. So the thing is that judicial officers differ in their proclivity to use electronic monitoring as they do in relation to prison and every other sanction. They don't get to choose the cases they hear in New South Wales or in Australia generally. They're effectively randomly assigned, and all this means in effect that we have ourselves an instrument in the form of proclivity to recommend electronic monitoring, which has an effect, we hope, on whether you get electronic monitoring, and that in turn has an effect on recidivism, but there's no direct causal relationship between proclivity to recommend electronic monitoring and recidivism itself. So we got ourselves, in a sense, a constructed natural experiment that we can work with. So the data for the study come from ROD, our reoffending database, and OIMS, the Offender Information Management System run by Corrective Services. The analysis sample consists of 7,300 basically offenders, all those who first became eligible for electronic monitoring between 2000 and 2007. 2007, you might recall, is the point where they changed from having a rehabilitation focus to having a deterrence focus. So we're just staying in that first phase. The full sample, though, was used to calculate judge proclivity because that wouldn't have been affected by the changeover in the regime from rehabilitation to deterrence. So the reoffending's measured up to 2016. There are some exclusions, cases before 2000 and 2007. Am I going too quickly? Is this okay? Just nod if you agree. All right. So cases where the judge had dealt with less than 10 electronic monitoring eligible offences. Cases, of course, with non-eligible electronic monitoring offences or sentences. Cases heard in courts with less than 2 judges because randomisation is occurring at the court level. Cases where the offender doesn't live in Sydney because at the time there was very little electronic monitoring outside Sydney. And cases where the offender is identified as Aboriginal because, as you all know, they have a different and much more complex relationship with the criminal justice system. So the primary dependent variable was reappearance in court within 24 months free time. Free time means time spent out of custody. So we allow for the fact that at some portion of the time, some subset of offenders can't actually offend. The secondary dependent variables, really versions of the first, longer term examinations at 12, 24, 36, up to 120 months. The controls are age, gender, number of court appearances in the last 5 years, legal representation and offence type. So Sarah Rahman, is Sarah around? Nope. Sarah nicely explained how we constructed the instrumental variable last time. We've adopted the same approach here. So we compute what's called the leave-out mean for Judge I and Case J. And what that is the proportion of all cases, except the one the judge is currently dealing with, where the judge imposed electronic monitoring. So we take all the previous cases the judge has dealt with that were eligible for EM, and we form the proportion where that judge imposed electronic monitoring. But wait, there's more. So what we then do is regress that leave-out mean against a fully interacted set of court and year finalisation fixed effects. And the reason we do that is that notwithstanding what we've done so far to try and identify something unaffected by factors that influence reoffending, we also recognise that there may be effects coming from the court or changes over time. So we want to get rid of that as well. So we're left with a pure measure of proclivity to impose an electronic monitoring penalty unaffected by case characteristics. So the residual from that regression is our IV. There's the IV distribution. That's the proclivity to impose an electronic monitoring penalty. And you can see joyfully there's huge variation in New South Wales in willing to use it. Ranges from about 2% at one extreme up to about 25%. So we've got lots of variation in willingness to use electronic monitoring. Well, I'll just let you look at that. You've seen so many of these, you must be tired of them by now. I know the policy people probably are, but the crucial thing is we're doing the usual thing. First, we're going to try and predict whether you're going to get electronic monitoring, and the crucial part of that is our measure of judicial proclivity. That's that, let's see if this works, that's that bit up there, and these are just additional controls here. So what we're going to do is get this here, the predicted likelihood of getting electronic monitoring. We're going to plug that into this equation here, so that by construction, we now have a variation in the likelihood of getting electronic monitoring, which has been prized apart from the factors that might influence both the penalty you get and the likelihood of reoffending. So, The assumptions, there are always 4 assumptions in this process. One of them is the exclusion assumption. We assume that the judge's tendency to refer for electronic monitoring assessment impacts reoffending only through the choice of sentence. We can't test that assumption. That's just something you have to accept the plausibility of the argument for. The second assumption is random assignment. We assume that the judge's tendency to refer for assessment is random, conditional on those caught by year fixed effects. We assume that the instrument is relevant, which is really just saying we hope it's a good predictor of whether you get a electronic monitoring penalty. And we assume monotonicity. In other words, we assume the judge's tendency affects all subgroups of offenders in the same direction. All of those assumptions were tested in the paper. I'm not going to tax your patience by going through all of them now. You can find the paper. I'll give you the link to the paper on the website if those economists amongst you want to go through the assumptions to see how they stood up to testing. But I am going to give you some indication of what I think is the most crucial one, which is the random assignment one and the relevance one. So here's the first stage estimates. The first stage is where we're just trying to predict the likelihood of getting electronic monitoring. And you can see the judge proclivity is significantly and positively related to the likelihood of getting electronic monitoring when you only control for those caught by year finalisation interacted fixed effects. You can see when we throw in the demographics and crime type, barely any change, still a strong predictor. And we add in criminal history and legal representation, nothing changes. The partial F test for this should be about 10, or that's a rule of thumb. You can see it's way above that. And if you care about these things, the under-identification test rejects the hypothesis that the model is under-identified. So everything in plain terms is going smoothly. We've got the circumstances we need to assess the effect of electronic monitoring on reoffending. So I said I would give you some indication of how well we'd succeeded in purging our instrument of any association with factors that affect reoffending, and that's what this table's all about. If you look at the first, down the left-hand side of the, is your left-hand side? Yeah. Left-hand side, you've got all the covariates we included in the model, and they are closely related, most of them, to the likelihood of getting electronic monitoring. So, for example, looking at age there, you can see that because it's negative, you're less likely to get electronic monitoring if you're older, or common sense suggests if you look, for example, at the number of court appearances in the last 5 years, it's negative, and to use a technical term, it's screamingly significant. That was a joke. All right. There is no technical term, screamingly significant, just in case you were wondering. Point is that these case characteristics and offender characteristics are quite correlated with the likelihood of getting electronic monitoring. But the beautiful thing is, when you look at judicial proclivity, you see that those characteristics are not significantly related to judicial proclivity. That's what we wanted. We wanted an instrument that was untied to the case characteristics that influence recidivism and likelihood of getting the penalty. So that all looks good. So here are the baseline effects. Our base comparison is a straightforward OLS regression where we don't make any effort at all to control for this omitted variable bias. And you can see where we just control for the caught by year interacted fixed effects. We've got a reduction in reoffending relative to prison of 25%. If we throw in the demographic and crime type controls, it drops a bit to 16%. And then if we add in criminal history, it drops in by 14%. But as I said, we're not here controlling for the problems of selection bias all of us have spoken about. The reduced form looks more encouraging. You can see it's still negative. We're still getting reductions in reoffending. But what really matters here is the last panel there, the instrumental variable results. When we only control for the caught by year fixed effects, interacted fixed effects, we're getting a 27% reduction. 27 percentage points, please forgive me, someone should have jumped up and corrected me. We control for, if we add in the demographic and crime type, we're getting a 21 percentage point reduction. And when we throw in the last of the controls, we're getting a 16 percentage point reduction in the likelihood of reoffending. Well, we'd like to know whether or not this applies to everybody and in every circumstance. So we're going to have a look at a couple of variations in procedure just to see how well this holds up. Here's the first one for the robustness test. In the first column there, adjust EM free time, what we do is instead of starting the clock at the point where the person gets electronic monitoring, we start the clock at the point where they go off electronic monitoring, because we want to know whether or not this is going to work after they've come off. And you can see you're still getting the effect you were looking for. And this is consistent with what an A has found. That is to say, this is not just some sort of temporary incapacitation effect. You're getting a result after they come off it. When you throw in all the controls, sure, it drops down a bit. You're still getting a 13% reduction, though, when you put all the controls in. The next slide, though, shows you something which differs a little bit from what an A found. Across the top there, you've got the follow-up period ranging from 12 months through to 120 months follow-up. And if you look at the first row, the all ages row, you can see that you're getting significant reductions in reoffending out to about 60 months. That's 5 years, which is quite substantial, quite a bit longer than the time they were spending on electronic monitoring. Seems to peter out about after that, although the coefficients are all negative. If you look at the less than 30 group, these are people who are less than 30 years of age, you can see that it hangs out to about 96 months or 8 years. That's quite a substantial effect. I'll come back in a little minute to the question of why that might be. But if you look at those who are over 30 and over, you're getting no significant effects at all. So unlike an A's work, where it doesn't seem to be dependent upon the age of the offender, the effects here seem to be confined to those who are under 30 years of age. Quite why that might be, I welcome suggestions on when we get to the end and we're close. So we were interested in estimating the savings for these things. So the assumptions on which the savings estimates are based are these, that the average prison sentence is 260 days. This is not for everybody in jail. This is just for those who are eligible for electronic monitoring. And that comes from our sample. The average time on home detention also comes from our sample. It's about 180 days. The probability of reoffending is about 14% from our sample. If you do reoffend, you can see your chance of going to jail is quite substantial, 44%. In separate modelling, Jen estimated the reduction in court appearances to be about 1, bit over 1, and that's important for the calculation of cost savings. And for those of you who don't know, it costs $182 a day for prison in Australia. That's a little bit more than Italy.
Does it include the fixed cost?
No, that's just the recurrent costs. Was yours fixed cost too?
No, variable.
Oh, variable costs. All right. We should swap notes. I noticed your prisons are a bit more crowded than ours, but I don't know. Actually, I don't know that at all. And $47 a day for home detention. So the net result is that per offender, we estimate a saving from the reduced cost of the sentence for the current offence of $25,200. Savings from future court cases averted, $449. Savings from custodial sentences averted, $3,600. So the total savings come to about $29,000 per offender, which if you apply across our total cohort adds up to about $5.8 million. Money, of course, that you could usefully invest in expanding electronic monitoring of home detention or investing in more effective rehabilitation programs. How am I going? Oh, that's good. We're at the end. So in summary, we get a 16 percentage point reduction relative, or just a 28% reduction relative to those who are imprisoned. The effects are limited to those under 30, but persist for at least 5 years. As I just said, they could be reinvested. The savings would obviously be much greater if it was expanded, but crucially, only if electronic monitoring is used as an alternative to prison. And we have a long history in Australia and New South Wales in using alternatives to prison for people who never would go to prison. Which raises the question of whether it would be better as a post-release device than a pre-release. But I think that's an interesting question to discuss. Of course, because it's a package, I don't know whether it's electronic monitoring, home detention, or the rehabilitation that comes with it is the mechanism that underpins these effects. That's something that would require further study, and I have finished. Oh, that's the paper, if you want to find it out. Any questions? Thanks. Oh, there's one. Oh, I do need you, Trace.
I might be asking you to stretch a little bit here, but do you have any hypothesis on what elements of home detention or EM are actually causing the impact, the benefits that we're getting?
I love speculating in the absence of evidence. I have no idea. Look, I'd be guessing, but I think it's, given the past research, I would suggest that it's the fact that it's not just surveillance that during the period we're talking about, there were substantial efforts being made to rehabilitate the offender in terms of work, in terms of training and so on. I think that squares away with what we've already seen earlier in relation to training in prison, but that would just be a guess. We do know from systematic reviews that supervision on its own doesn't seem to have much of an effect, but I'm not sure. Anybody else? A question? You're all dying for lunch. Oh, two. Jessie and...
My question pertains to shared parental responsibility and parental arrangements, and I was just wondering for, I guess, like kids who gets time spent with like the detainee, like how that sort of like plays out. Is it sort of like supervised or?
That's a question I'd love to be able to answer. Is there anybody from Corrective Services here that could spell out the mechanics of that? Well, they're very shy or they're not here. I don't know too much. I mean, I went out to see how the process works, but I didn't actually get to see what the interactions between the offender and the supervising officer were. So I don't know what specific interventions they make or what relations they organise with the offender. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question very well.
I'm going to be a little greedy and ask another question, if that's okay. So my next question is, I know that detainees have to sort of report if they move accommodations. So on the off chance that they don't, is that sort of like an automatic breach, or is that like, do they get like a slap on the wrist, or?
Well, when I spoke to the man who actually does the surveillance, the impression I got from him was that it's not a mechanical process. They don't automatically issue an arrest warrant the moment the person, but they go looking to find out, and if they don't find out quickly and there isn't a reasonable excuse, then they issue an arrest warrant. But again, that's the detail about Corrective Services operations that I couldn't tell you as much as I should be able to tell you. Jesse, you had one.
Thanks. So yeah, about age.
Sorry?
Age.
Age.
Because I mean, that's interesting that usually as you would see, like as people, when they're getting older, for example, all sorts of stuff happens with risk. So I thought, and it's in a lot of other studies too, sort of the older kind of cohorts tend to perform maybe better. So I thought, I don't know what your ideas were around that in terms of, you know, that your results are kind of showing that younger people are actually performing possibly better on EM. So did you have any thoughts about that?
Well, one caveat to bear in mind is that this is a local average treatment effect. This is an effect in a sense that's constrained to the people who could have gone either way depending on the judge they got. So generalisation to the entire cohort's not feasible. But in terms of the age effect, I honestly don't know. I mean, I'd love to speculate if I could think of a plausible explanation, but I don't know. And I'm worried about it because NA didn't find it, and I'm not aware of any other study which found that kind of limit. But it was certainly clear in our data. I think it's just the sort of thing we need to dig a bit deeper in. That would help to answer your question.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Don, you said that that Indigenous prisoners were left out of your analysis. Can you just explain why, and maybe also a follow-on to that is, have you found any difference in electronic monitoring outcomes for Indigenous people?
It's very difficult because the number of people who got, the number of Indigenous people who were placed on electronic monitoring was tiny. Because the total number was tiny, so we didn't include them for that simple reason. It just would have had two very different groups of offenders in the mix. I have no idea, but I think it's a really important question, given that 20% of the prison population is Indigenous, to find out whether or not it does work as well for them. In order to find that out, we really need to build up the numbers going onto electronic monitoring, and I'm really hoping two things. Firstly, that the latest reforms actually do increase the number of people on electronic monitoring home detention, and I'm also hoping that Anae will help me answer that question. She's not listening at the moment, but I know she's going to get a call. So I think it's a crucial issue. It's even more crucial in a sense with the kids, because 50% of that population, whether it's ever possible or even desirable to include electronic monitoring in those circumstances, is a moot point. At the moment, the children's number of children in custody has been dropping like a stone, while the adults have been rising like a rocket. So the focus is on the adult sphere. Did I miss the second question?
Hi, my question was actually about children, and I don't know whether children have ever used, like, electronic monitoring has ever been used on children.
No, I don't think so, yeah.
And so we don't know whether it might impact, especially those entering juvenile justice and re-entering.
It's a pretty awful thought to think of a young offender with, an anklet in those circumstances.
Yeah.
And since the custody problem, over-representation or the general custodial growth is going in the right direction for juveniles, it's probably not something even worth thinking about. Yep.
Thanks, John. Is there anything
Oh,
we can...
Jen, how are
hello,
you?
Good, thanks.
Haven't seen you for ages.
I know, I'm back.
Are you going to cause trouble again?
No, well, I hope not. Is there anything we can extrapolate about using EM in bail situations here?
Could we? Well, it looks potentially promising. I guess the thing that I would worry about is that all these people who would behave perfectly well on bail will end up getting electronic monitoring.
It'd have to be as an alternative.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it does worry me from a purely jurisprudential point of view about putting constraints on people who haven't yet been convicted of anything. I understand the necessity of that, where a person's got a history of offending on bail and so on. But how you stop courts just, doing that by habit when the circumstances might not warrant it. But I'm not answering your question. The answer is I think it probably would reduce the offending on bail.
Maybe you want to look into that for us. Yeah.
Okay, Jen. Nice to see you again. Yeah.
Very quick question. Do you have any clue why electronic monitoring seems to have much stronger effect in New South Wales than in the pilot project in France?
Oh, well, they're just not as good as us. No, I mean, I was curious because it looked to me like in France, it's primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, primarily supervision and surveillance. It didn't look like it had a strong rehabilitation component to it. So that's one possible explanation. It may be that people are more afraid of coming back to New South Wales prisons than they are coming back to an Italian prison. I have no idea beyond that. I mean, Italy's a nice place. Anyway, let's not go on about that. French prisons, I meant to say.
Hi, I'm from Corrective Services.
Oh, you've been hiding.
If I could help answer those earlier questions. So was it one regarding children and whether or not there's anything in place around supervision? Is that, yeah? So I guess with all electronically monitored offenders I work for New South Wales Corrective Services, there is a supervision component, so any risks related to children would be looked at in their case management. And I believe sex offenders are not eligible for electronic monitoring in New South Wales, so if that was a concern regarding child welfare. But with all supervision, electronic monitored offenders, their risks being assessed through that process in case management. And the other question was regarding breach and if there was any deviation from the schedule, if that would result in an immediate breach. It's normally a process of contact from the electronic monitoring room to the offender to see where they are, what's going on, why they've deviated, and when they'll be returning home or to wherever they're going. And if there's any issues that arise from that, it's escalated to their officer and then up through the process if it's not resolved from there. So not always an automatic breach. Obviously, there's reasons that people deviate from the schedule that are explainable.
Thank you. Very helpful. Okay. Thank you.